Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and we welcome you, and thank you for coming to the first in our year-long celebration and exploration of the 50th anniversary of the publication of Bernard Lonergan's groundbreaking book, Method in Theology. My name is Patrick Byrne. I'm the director of the Lonergan Institute here at Boston College, and we're so glad to have you with us. And for those of you who are participating by video streaming, we welcome you as well. Bernard Lonergan was a Canadian Jesuit philosopher and theologian who devoted his career toward the challenges of doing philosophy and theology in the post-World War II era. He lived from 1904 to 1984. He taught in Canada, Rome, Harvard, and finally here at Boston College. He wrote over 7,000 pages, which are now available in his collected works, which is published out of the University of Toronto Press. Yet he only published less than a quarter of that during his own lifetime. But he regarded Method in Theology as the crown of his work. Method in Theology, published 50 years ago in 1972. As a young man, Lonergan came to the conclusion that Roman Catholic theology had not adequately responded to the ethical, moral, and religious challenges raised by modern natural science and by modern critical historical method. He did not find the attempts by previous theologians, Catholic or Protestant, satisfactory. After completing his studies of Thomas Aquinas in 1949, he therefore set to the task of finding a proper method for theology. He wrote, "My intention was an exploration of methods, generally in preparation for a study of the method of theology. But in 1952, it became clear that I was due to start teaching at the Gregorian University in Rome in 1953. So I changed my plan, and I decided to round off what I had done and publish it under the title Insight, a Study of Human Understanding." Only Lonergan could say that the book Insight was rounded off at 750 pages. But he did spend the next 15 years working diligently to finish off what he found still missing, and the product was his book, Method in Theology. It has taken scholars decades to fully comprehend the significance and applications of that life's work. This year we celebrate and explore his achievement with a series of 6 lectures and responses stretching from today until November. Our effort in this series of lectures has been to invite scholars of Lonergan's thought to speak on issues of contemporary importance and to ask for responses from scholars from other areas of specialization, along with those who have specialized in Lonergan's thought. And I want to express my gratitude and indebtedness in particular to my colleagues, Professor Dr. Ligita Ryliskyte and Jeremy Wilkins, and of course to the staff of the Lonergan Institute, Mary Elliott and Ann McInerney, and to the graduate students from the Lonergan Institute who've been so instrumental in making this occasion and the subsequent lectures possible. I'd like to now introduce my colleague and friend of long standing, Professor Emerita M. Shawn Copeland. She has been Professor of Systematic Theology here at Boston College from 2013 to the present. Prior to joining the faculty at Boston College, she was for 16 years Associate Professor of Systematic Theology and Associate Director of the Theology Master's Degree Program at the Institute for Black Catholic Studies at Xavier University in New Orleans, in Louisiana, Xavier University of Louisiana in New Orleans. And prior to that, she held faculty appointments at Marquette University, Yale University, St. Norbert's College, and Harvard University. She's received so many awards for her work in theology that it's not possible to mention them all here. but she has received honorary degrees from 6 different institutions of higher learning. Most recently, she also received the John Courtney Murray Award for Distinguished Achievement in Theology, presented by the Catholic Theological Society of America, the Marianist Award from the University of Dayton to a Catholic scholar, author, and theologian who has made an outstanding contribution to the intellectual life. She received the Catholic Press Association Award for the Best Essay, Revisiting Racism. She received the Ann O'Hara Graff Memorial Award, Women's Consultation in Constructive Theology from the Catholic Theological Society of America. And she also received the Women of Color Award from the Wisconsin Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Wisconsin. And that's just a short excerpt of many honors she's received. She's the author of over 85 scholarly articles and 5 books, including her highly esteemed and Fleshing Freedom, Body, Race, and Being, Subversive Power of Love, The Vision of Henriette Delille, and Uncommon Faithfulness, The Black Catholic Experience. My first memory of Shawn Copeland goes back to the days when Bernard Lonergan was still teaching here at Boston College. I was a rookie faculty member, and Shawn was a doctoral candidate in the theology department. We were both attending Lonergan's course on analogy and symbol in theology, I think. That was the one. And we were both trying mightily to understand what Lonergan was talking about. Since that time, I have been impressed with the ways that she finds to draw out the best in people and bringing what she has found there to share with others. She's praised for how widely and sensitively she reads the works of others and how she brings their diverse ideas into books and articles that she writes. Over the years, I've come to admire Shawn, both for her keen intelligence, but also her radiating kindness and compassion and her great sense of humor. I recall one conversation where Shawn said, "You know, I'm a bridge person." And that really made a big impression on me, because that is how I have seen her over the years. She listens sensitively and thoughtfully to what people say and finds in them the things that they have to share with one another, and often says it to others in ways that make their ideas shine brightly. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you my friend and colleague, M. Shawn Copeland.
Well, good afternoon. Just to make sure you're still awake. Let me begin by thanking the organizers of this event. Professor Patrick Byrne, Director of the Lonergan Institute here at Boston College, Ms. Mary Elliott, who is the Assistant Director, my colleague still at work, I don't know if he's here, Jeremy Wilkins.
He's on Zoom.
On Zoom, still at work. And Dr. Carrie Cronin, Associate Director of the Perspectives Program, and who, for me, has been a long-time companion in arms in all things Lonergan. And finally, but not least of all, Ms. Mary McInerney, who's done a lot of the legwork and groundwork to move things around here, as well as all the students who are handling the video and Zooming, so that we are all, wherever we are, in whatever time zone, are here together. Again, special thanks to Professor Byrne and Wilkins and Sister Dr. Ligita Ryliskyte, who dreamt and designed this series in honor of the 50th anniversary of Method in Theology, and in honor of the labor of Jesuit philosopher theologian Bernard Lonergan, who has such far-reaching influence on theologians, trying to help us to grasp the contemporary issues and to meet these. That's our challenge. But it also, as Lonergan tried to impress upon us, it's a collective effort. It's not the individual, but the group that transforms the culture. I first heard the name Bernard Lonergan in a lecture given by African-American Catholic priest, now Bishop Edward Braxton, in August 1976 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, during the 41st Annual Eucharistic Congress. Braxton was addressing a group of African-American Catholic laity, vowed religious, and clergy, situating the Second Vatican Council in the context of the Church's long dynamic history and its complex relationship with culture, noting especially what Bernard Lonergan frequently referred to as the shift from classical to modern culture. I found the ideas intriguing, and I made a mental note of Lonergan's name. A few weeks later, in September, I moved to New York City to work for Theology in the Americas, a process and organization that introduced Latin American liberation theology to North American Christians. At TIA, or Theology in the Americas, Baptist minister Muhammad Kenyatta and I were hired to plan and manage the first national consultation on Black theology, scheduled for August 1977. One day, not long after my arrival in New York, I wandered into a bookstore on the Upper West Side. Quite unexpectedly, I found and purchased a copy of Lonergan's Method in Theology. Back at my apartment, I opened the book, and it is this book still. It's been through the wars, but it's still here. Back at my apartment, I opened that book and I tried to read it. I was really eager to get into it. I could decipher the black marks on the pages, but did not really understand the reference, the objects or realities that the words denoted. Already more than conversant with Black and Latin American theologies and feminist theologies of liberation, the word praxis was nowhere to be found in Method in Theology. History was the single meaningful word that these theologies seemed to have in common. I closed the book, I put it aside, but I kept it. In September of 1977, I began graduate studies in theology here at Boston College. And the first course for which I registered was Symbol and Analogy with Bernard Lonergan and Fred Lawrence. I brought a copy of the syllabus.
Oh my God.
So we were reading 5 chapters of Method, and I had my book. I was prepared. So what began for me then was more than 40 years of reading Method in Theology, of wrestling to understand the realities that its words denote, and to do theology in accord with Lonergan's inspiration. This afternoon, I want to speak about Lonergan and the decolonial turn. So I want to begin with 3 quotes, and you'll recognize certainly 2 of them. The philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. Karl Marx. How indeed is a mind to become conscious of its own bias when that bias springs from a communal flight from understanding and is supported by the whole texture of a civilization? Bernard Lonergan. Finally, the ontological or metaphysical possibility of liberation remains to be argued, explained, uncovered. If oppression theory is not liberatory, it is useless from the point of view of the oppressed person. It is discouraging, demoralizing. Maria Ligones, feminist philosopher. The work of the Canadian Jesuit philosopher-theologian Bernard Lonergan is widely acclaimed as a major creative achievement in contribution to theological method. For over 50 years, numerous national and international conferences, symposia, workshops, journals, and books have been devoted to studying, interpreting, and applying his cognitional theory and theological method. 35 years ago, only a handful of theologians, notably Matthew Lamb and Frederick Lawrence, engaged the social implications of Lonergan's thought. But since the early 1990s, that interest has expanded and deepened remarkably thanks to the efforts of theologians like Robert Doran, Cynthia Crysdale, James Marsh, Jeremy Blackwood, and Cyril Orgide, to name a few. This lecture aims to explore some sympathetic resonances between certain philosophical and theological proposals developed by Lonergan and by decolonial thinkers. At first blush, to associate Lonergan with the notion of the decolonial may seem surprising and perhaps even disconcerting. Some scholars and students of Lonergan's thought might dismiss the effort outright as having little value. Proponents of decolonial thought might surmise that this project implies a, quote, rescue mission, close quote, designed to demonstrate how Lonergan's thought might carry out a salvage operation. But we should acknowledge that from the very beginning of his theological career, Lonergan pursued many of the concerns that stimulate the work of decolonial thinkers and theorists, as well as political and liberation theologians. We find among Lonergan's earliest writings brief articles and reviews on the need for the masses of people to achieve economic independence if democracy is to be more than a noble experiment. This is 1941. The renewal of rural life in the face of increased urbanization and industrialization, 1942. If you're in the United States, we should be thinking about farmers, where our food comes from. The great materialist trinity, capitalism, communism, and Nazism, 1942. The relation of, quote, a supernatural orientation in life to the cumulative, interlocking, and crushing evils of mass production, mass living, mass education, mass amusement, mass emotions, mass hatreds, and mass wars, 1943. Economics and social political consequences of the Eucharist, 1947. Indeed, earlier in 1935, during his studies in philosophy and theology at Rome's Gregorian University, Lonergan planned to work out, quote, a Thomistic metaphysic of history that will throw Hegel and Marx, despite the enormity of their influence on this very account, into the shade, close quote. In a letter to his superiors, Lonergan mentioned two papers that he had drafted, A Philosophy of History and Panton Anacephaliosis. The idea was to advance a, quote, a conscious body of social science illuminated by supernatural light, close quote. Lonergan recognized that the concrete implications of writing on the Pauline notion of Christ as the anacephaliosis, the recapitulation of all things in Christ, this is Ephesians 1:10, that this would presuppose, quote, definite views on all things theological, philosophic, historical, social, political, even economic, close quote. Bernard Lonergan held more than a casual interest in these issues, and he grasped them from the higher viewpoint of the workings of grace in order to help us navigate the cultural crises of our time. My remarks this afternoon are organized in three parts. The first part concerns decoloniality, a few of its major proponents, main issues, and a few difficulties. The second part brings some of Lonergan's salient ideas into conversation with decolonial theory. And the third part briefly considers theology and decoloniality. So decoloniality, thinkers, theorists, issues, difficulties. For more than 2 decades now, Latin American and Caribbean thinkers have increasingly deployed a critique of the enduring matrix of domination spawned by Western European and European North American colonialism and imperialism. They named this critique decoloniality, in an effort to understand and effectively respond to the praxial, that is, the lingering epistemological and practical effects of conquest and colonization. Although Western European colonialism has come to a formal end, the coloniality of power it produced is reproduced in specific social discriminations now codified as racial, ethnic, indigenous, anthropological, or national, and these linger in our contemporary. These discriminations have been ideologized, that is, uncritically assumed, appropriated, and transmitted. So they've been ideologized as objective or scientific or natural phenomena, even as the history and relations of power responsible for these intersubjective constructions are occluded. Decolonial thinkers chart the ongoing cost of modernity coloniality in terms of their ongoing impacts on human flesh and blood, human bodies, the physical, and hearts, the affective and psychic, human minds, cognition, and souls, religion and spirituality. Decoloniality ought not to be confused with post-colonialism or postmodernism. These terms are ambiguous and descend from complex genealogies. On the one hand, the post and post-colonialism may refer to a chronological and historical after the departure of the colonists or settlers, while literary critics have deployed the term in ascertaining and discussing the cultural effects of colonization. At the same time, post-colonialism, as Bill Ashcroft has argued, connotes, quote, a range of material conditions and rhizomic patterns of discursive struggles, ways of contending with various specific forms of colonial oppression, close quote. Postmodernism contests the grand, absolutizing narratives of modernity, but too often maintains that same intellectual arrogance in failing to grapple with what Walter Mignolo names, quote, the darker side of Western modernity, close quote. While grasping Western modernity's colonial underside, postmodern thinkers too often unwittingly repeat the very intellectual hubris that they critique. Decoloniality refers to, quote, the process of revealing and dismantling colonialist power in all its forms, whether obvious and coercive or concealed and persuasive, and includes aspects of those institutional and cultural forces that maintain colonialist power. For despite the physical and literal departure of the colonial powers, coloniality did not disappear. The coloniality of power, its substance, its social constructions, imaginaries, languages, metaphors, practices, hierarchies, values, and violence continue to be manifest throughout the world and to determine the social, gender, racial, and epistemological value systems of the contemporary. Now, perhaps in the English-speaking world, the name most associated with decoloniality is that of Walter Mignolo. For Mignolo, decoloniality poses epistemic repercussions, this is his phrase, epistemic repercussions for life, for living, and it implies a strategic way of thinking and doing that he identifies as epistemic disobedience or epistemic delinking. Aníbal Quijano, another significant decolonial theorist, denotes decoloniality as epistemic reconstruction. So we've got repercussions and reconstruction. So Quijano understands decoloniality as epistemic reconstruction. With Quijano, Mignolo seeks a way out of the colonial matrices of power, a way out of Eurocentrism as a hegemonic structure of knowledge and beliefs. Epistemic disobedience, or epistemic delinking, advocates that one, quote, extricates oneself from the linkages between rationality, modernity, and coloniality, and from all power which is not constituted by free decision made by free people, close quote. Note that, because what does it mean to be free? This is really an issue. Free people making free decisions. Epistemic disobedience makes visible those, quote, other knowledges, other philosophies, knowledges and philosophies otherwise. Other knowledges that the continental model continues to refuse and deny, close quote. Thus, decolonial thinking interrogates, problematizes, contests the residue of colonial histories, structural or institutional, and intersubjective relations as these break into the contemporary. At the same time, decoloniality entails movements, actions for human dignity, for indigeneity, for self-government. Decoloniality affirms the emergence of border thinking or subaltern reason. Remember Gayatri Spivak's famous phrase, can the subaltern speak? So, border thinking or subaltern reason. Border thinking, according to Mignolo, quote, brings to the foreground the irreducible epistemological difference between the perspective from the colonial difference and the forms of knowledge that, being critical of modernity, coloniality, and capitalism, still remain within the territory, in custody of the abstract universals, close quote. Catherine Walsh puts it this way, quote, the fact that philosophy became global does not mean that it is also uni-versal. It simply means that the Greek concept of philosophy, love of wisdom, was picked up by the intelligentsia linked to imperial colonial expansion, the foundation of capitalism and Western modernity, close quote. Mignolo seeks to uncover the way in which the coloniality of power functions to create difference, to create material and cognitive, this is his phrase, backwardness, to categorize representation, to control meaning, to produce, to evaluate, and to manage the colonial difference. Epistemic disobedience means to contest coloniality's hegemony of knowledge. It means to delink from, to break away from language, concepts, space, time, and history that have been colonized, and to refrain from borrowing and deploying the founding concepts of that knowledge. That is, concepts like center periphery, tradition modern, primitive civilized. Decolonial, then, or decoloniality, calls for a project of liberation that involves a double gesture. First, unmasking the limited situation of modern knowledges and their link to coloniality. And second, other thinking that calls for plurality, intercultural dialogue. Decolonial thinking, Mignolo argues, quote, presupposes delinking epistemically and politically from the web of imperial knowledge, from disciplinary management, close quote. Now, before leaving this summary, let me point to at least two issues, and certainly there are others, that are conspicuous by their absence in terms of the way in which decolonial thinkers have been dealing with these. First, the decolonial project's attitude toward Christianity, and second, its lack of attention to gender and sexuality. First, Christianity comes under severe attack by decolonial theorists. So, for instance, Mignolo writes, quote, Christianity became, with the expulsion of Jews and Moors and the discovery of America, the first global design of the modern colonial world system, and consequently, the anchor of Occidentalism and the coloniality of power, drawing the external borders as the colonial difference, which became reconverted and resemitized in the late 18th and 19th centuries with the expansion of Britain and France to Asia and Africa. Global designs are the complement of universalism in the making of the modern colonial world, close quote. Now we know that over the next several hundred years, from the expulsion of Jews and Moors from Spain in the late 15th century, that Christianity and theology were ensnared deeply, dramatically, destructively in colonial exploration and expropriation, slavery, and erotic violence. Not for the first time, though, the context for theology coalesced as empire and charted a course now, this time, into a modern colonial world. On the other hand, Christianity's relation to the global anthropological deformation that resulted in what Sylvia Wynter calls the doctrine of man is as deep as its relation to the global transformative social praxis inspired by the critical recovery of the memory of the life, death, and resurrection of the Jewish rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth, and articulated in theologies arising in situations of oppression. Second point, feminist philosopher Maria Lugones declares that for some decolonial thinkers, sex seems, quote, unproblematically biological, close quote. She responds to the theoretical blind spot around gender and sex, what Lonergan would call a scotoma, blind spot. She responds to this not only by probing and setting out interconnections between race, gender, and sexuality, but situating these both in the context of the imperial modern colonial world and in the context of efforts to decolonize imperial knowledge and to generate decolonial knowledge. It's both ways. So these things are missing both from the exterior, but also within the interior debates. Moreover, Lugones points out that in confrontation with modernity's ontological categories of atomization, homogeneity, and separableness, contemporary women of color and two-thirds world women, in particular, think, theorize, write, and act otherwise, close quote. Central to the ongoing expansion of decolonial feminism is constant interrogation of race, ethnicity, indigeneity, gender, sexuality, heterosexuality, and patriarchy, as well as those, quote, heteropatriarchal frameworks and norms that organize social structures and institutions, as well as most aspects of everyday life, close quote. These feminist thinkers, intellectuals, and activists seek to disrupt, quote, the white feminist universal, close quote, in their pursuit of clarifying and theorizing coloniality and decoloniality. So the second part here, looking for some resonances and responses, critiques and clarifications. First, at the heart of the decolonial project stands the embodied human subject who knows, loves, values, decides, and acts within layered historical, religious, moral, cultural, and social contexts. Decolonial thinking, quote, assumes the aboutness of what we think, write, talk, and argue, does not have an existence independent of the who, the agency of the enunciation and of the universes of meaning in which our thinking, talking, writing, arguing is framed, close quote. It is tempting to identify Minolo's insistence on the relation between the who and the aboutness, that's the whatness really, with the function of the isomorphic in Lonergan's cognitional operations. But Lonergan's account is about knowing, not thinking. And for Lonergan, thinking is not knowing. In Lonergan's terms, the human subject is incarnate consciousness, empirical, intellectual, rational, and responsible, a self-transcending subject who is an origin of value in true love. As incarnate consciousness, the human subject synthesizes, even when dissonant, objects of, quote, objects of consciousness, as well as the affects and values that qualify them, close quote. Always the human subject is situated within particular historical, religious, cultural, social context. Distinct and particular meanings and values give rise to particular concrete social arrangements. But the most basic task for the human subject is the achievement of authenticity, authenticity in one's knowing and doing, living and acting mindfully in relationship with others. On Lonergan's account, then, cognitional theory unites knowing and doing. His analysis identifies, retrieves, and isolates three discrete, basic, dynamic levels: experiencing, understanding, and judging. On this account, knowing is a dynamic, self-assembling, self-correcting structure involving distinct and irreducible activities: seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, tasting, inquiring, imagining, understanding, conceiving, reflecting, weighing the evidence, judging. No single one of these activities alone is knowing. Knowing is the conjunction of experiencing, understanding, judging. Each of these activities is a component in human knowing, but none alone ought to be confused with knowing itself. Knowing then is a process, prompted by wonder, promoted by questioning, tested and verified in an individual's own experimentation and performance. Self-appropriation is about that experimentation and performance. Through self-appropriation on the cognitional level, the knower moves backward to discover herself as intelligent, as asking and answering questions, as having insights, as formulating and expressing concepts, as marshaling and weighing evidence, as passing judgments. What she in self-appropriation is not some speculative knowing, what she reaches in self-appropriation is not some speculative knowing self, nor some abstract model of knowledge with its components verified in someone else's understanding. Rather, what she reaches is the personally affirmed and appropriated structure of her own knowing, her own experiencing, her own intelligent inquiry and insight, her own critical reflection and judging and deciding and acting. Decolonial thought and theory may be captive to ocular explanations of knowing, certainly imaginal, but its focus on knowledge as production, or production of theory, risks commodifying decoloniality. Minolo's phrase, epistemic disobedience, is noteworthy. I like it very much, actually, because that's what I think cognitional theory is, epistemic disobedience. You're not going along with the program. You're calling a halt to it. Minolo's phrase, epistemic disobedience, is noteworthy for its intention to de-link. That is, break with Western or Eurocentric knowledge. Again, it is an overcoming of Eurocentrism. But what delinking entails is never clarified. Lonergan's cognitional theory bridges a non-exclusionary paradigm of thinking humans and offers us a self-correcting process for decolonial notions of unpacking, delinking, and border thinking. We attend not merely to the objects of our investigation and reflection, we also attend to ourselves as intending subjects and to our differing acts of experiencing, understanding, judging, and deciding. Second, I have 4 points here. Second, while some of Lonergan's late 20th and current 21st century readers might consider him gender blind, there is a way to read his understanding about humankind, the concrete universal. Lonergan's earliest reflections on the notion of the concrete universal emphasize that humanity is not abstract, not a mere aggregation of isolated individuals. Humankind is one intelligible reality. Humanity is multiple and concrete and varied. Many by matter, yet one in having one nature. The concrete universal that is humankind embraces all historical time, and that is the human and historical becoming in whom we live and know and act. Close quote. Now, along with this, Lonergan proposes the notion of the transcultural. This, of course, I'm sure raises a lot of concerns for a lot of different people. This notion neither reduces cultures to examples of some general paradigm, nor proposes some abstract system by which to measure or compare cultures one with another. Hence, there's no ahead and no backward. Matthew Lamb, in his study of the transcultural, recalls for us that the proper context for catching on to Lonergan's understanding of the transcultural is his articulation of the transition from a classicist notion to an empirical notion of culture. Now, it's easy to misunderstand what Lonergan means by this shift from a classicist notion to an empirical notion of culture. Frequently, his comments are taken to mean that this shift has already been effected. Especially those of us at home in Western culture are tempted to think that the empirical notion of culture has been realized already in our contemporary forms and experience. But by empirical, Lamb argues that Lonergan means an orientation to culture which attends to both the data of sense and data of consciousness. The data of sense and the data of consciousness. Again, those familiar with Lonergan's thought will recall that this definition adverts to what he articulates as the third stage of meaning, a shift toward interiority, with its invitation to appropriate the operations of one's conscious intentionality. This invitation to self-appropriation is Lonergan's notion of the transcultural. That invitation is transcultural, not in its explicit formulation, but in the realities to which the formulation refers. For these realities are not the products of any culture, but the principles that produce cultures, preserve them, develop them. Moreover, since it is to these realities we refer when we speak of Homo sapiens, it follows that these realities are transcultural with respect to all truly human cultures. Third, it is quite true, Lonergan argues, that objective knowing is not yet authentic human living. But without objective knowing, there is no authentic living, close quote. This takes us to the border of ethics. Rather than outline a method of ethics that is some extrinsic objective code or predetermined manual or correct set of judgments, Lonergan roots ethics in the dynamic invariant structures of human knowing and human doing, in the dynamic structure of rational self-consciousness. Because that structure is latent and operative in everyone's choosing, it is universal on the side of the subject. Because that structure can be dodged, we can decide not to do what we know to be right, to be true. It grounds a dialectical criticism of subjects. Hence, that dynamic invariant structure lays the foundation for personal and social ethical decision, for personal and social concern with a concrete good, personal action in manifold concrete situations. Still, to know and to choose and to do the good is difficult. Battered and abused bodies, broken promises and treaties, and wounded hearts reveal moral impotence to be a fact. A man or woman can dodge what intelligence, reasonableness, and responsibility demand. She or he can quell the pressure for consistency in knowing and doing. He or she can surrender to the vortex of irrationality and sin. Fourth, on the one hand, human progress depends upon the authentic judgments and decisions, the authentic human living of persons and communities. Just think what it's like to live without people making really authentic judgments and decisions because they've ignored the data, or they've falsified the data, or they've tossed out the data, or they've ignored whatever it is that you want to, whatever verb you want to use. But human progress depends upon the authentic judgments and decisions, the authentic human living of persons and communities. If persons and or communities make judgments and decisions distorted by neurotic need or dramatic bias, or individual bias or group bias, or general bias of common sense, the proper functioning of society is interrupted and triggers what Lonergan calls the longer cycle of decline. Now, we know that Lonergan gives the term bias very technical and specific denotation. On his account, bias is the more or less conscious and deliberate choice in the face of what we perceive to be a potential threat to our well-being, to exclude further information or data from consideration in our understanding, judgment, reflection, and decision. All human beings are susceptible to bias. All human beings are susceptible to bias. All human beings are susceptible to bias. The bias which distorts and inhibits our conscious performance in everyday life by blinding our understanding. He distinguishes for us four principal manners in which this distortion may occur: dramatic, individual, group, and general bias. So something about each of these. Dramatic bias takes the form of the denial of affect in the day-to-day living out of our lives. It reveals itself not only in refusal to understand, but in refusal to behave and grow emotionally in healthy and life-giving ways. Dramatic bias reflects emotional and common sense maturity that projects into our imagination an idealized picture of ourselves. When we come to make decisions, we are enticed to eliminate from consideration what is at odds with that idealized picture. But attentiveness to our feelings is important. If we deny that we feel resentment or anger or fear, if we deny that we feel used or exploited, that we feel disappointed in a parent or a spouse or a child or a friend or a leader, we are repressing the feelings that we feel. For most of us, this has a threatening quality. To deny our feelings is, as Nancy Ring once wrote, quote, to make our story more of a lie than a symbol of the ongoing negotiation of our lives, close quote. Dramatic bias thrives in oppressed or marginalized cultures. Members of the dominant or privileged group are given permission to project their personal inadequacies on members of the dominated or non-privileged group or groups. These women and men harm not only themselves by blunting the invitation to self-transcendence, but they cause incalculable suffering to those whom they dominate. The oppressed, too, are unable to face and incorporate personal inadequacies into their daily living. They are beset with internalized self-doubt and self-hatred. Individual bias is a conscious distortion in development not only of the individual's intelligence, but of her or his affective and experiential orientation as well. Individual bias manifests itself in selfish pursuit of personal desires at the expense of human relationships and social cooperations, at the expense of human good, of culture and society. When we yield to the temptation of individual bias, we refuse opportunities to meet others who may be of different opinions or nations or cultures, to engage them, to open ourselves to them. When we yield to the temptations of individual bias, we repudiate the intersubjectivity that is a basic component of our humanity. For affective and cognitive development occurs only within intersubjectivity. Although individual bias is potentially operative in any society, the distortions that result in political, economic, and technological patterns in a given society cannot be attributed to individual bias alone. Group bias may find expression in jingoism and belligerence, in xenophobia and bigotry, in male chauvinism and misogyny, thereby disrupting attempts to bring about the good of order. Group bias sacrifices intelligent, responsible discernment and the bringing about of the human good in culture and society to the vicious pursuit of the interests of the dominant group, while insights that include the experiences or interests of other and marginalized groups are stifled and repressed. Members of whichever dominating group reject authentic forms of solidarity with the suffering of marginalized others. Thus, they withdraw from sensitive and experiential contact with so-called non-privileged members of society. Every time you listen to the news and someone says, well, we never have crime in our neighborhood, or this kind of thing never happens in our city, I'm sort of thinking to myself, we're all living here. We're all living here. That comment, in some ways, perhaps in a mild way, infers that it takes place elsewhere over there with those people. When we withdraw from sensitive and experiential contact with so-called non-privileged members of society, we all miss out. Biased decisions and actions may be enforced not only through legislation and custom, but also through police surveillance and control. In such situations, marginalized groups erupt in frustration, in civil disobedience, in bitterness, and finally in rebellion. The course of authentic human and social development is derailed, and the conditions for generating new intelligent insights, and taking practical, responsible, healing, and creating action to meet and reverse the deteriorating decline in society are precluded. Poignantly, the colonial matrix of power is rife with examples of bias, not only among the conquistadors, but also among the conquered. Regarding the former, dramatic individual and group bias play a role in the conquest. The desire to prove oneself, or to scratch one's way up from poverty. Self-regarding self-interest. There's a clip, a little clip in The Mission, the film The Mission. There are anachronisms there. There's no indigenous clergy, okay? But when you're there, there's a moment when the captain, I guess, whoever he is, has been ordered to shoot the people. And they're all lined up on the beach. And the generals, of course, are way up in the back, huh? And they're given the message, shoot. And he stands there, and this woman is coming with a monstrance. Somebody has a crucifix. Go look at that scene. And it's a wonderful reenactment because he sort of stops. And he's thinking, wow, I know what that is. I know what a monstrance is. I know what a crucifix is. There's a moment, just a fleeting moment of fellow feeling. I always think of that. He knows what he's about to do. And what does he do? He drops his arms in frustration and they do it. There are ways in which we can learn how to pay attention very carefully to our own selves by paying attention to what artists are also trying to show us. If we think of this group, this is about group power and superiority of arms. Now regarding the latter, here's Enrique Dussel. He writes with such sensitivity and pathos. He writes, quote, the Indians had to recompose entirely their existence to endure the inhuman oppression that was their lot as the first victims of modernity. So expropriation of land. What was important and sacred to you is no longer, it's just an object of property. It's just property. The Africans, he writes, unlike any, quote, other people in human history, and in such numbers, were reified as merchandise. Something to be bought and sold, to be owned, possessed. And then the mestizos, he writes, quote, live in their own flesh the contradictory tension of modernity as both emancipation and sacrificial myth. Now finally, there's the general bias of common sense, by which common sense considers itself only competent, or sufficiently inadequate, or sufficiently adequate in all situations. Because self-correction affords common sense the capacity to manage several situations, it assumes that it can judge and manage any and all others. This form of bias constricts and distorts insights for the practical, intelligent, imaginative ordering of the good in culture and society. It further restricts intelligence to the immediate and the short term, while ignoring the long-term consequences of such ad hoc measures. The general bias of common sense focuses on short-term practicality. Its preoccupation is whatever is immediately realizable with whatever means are immediately at hand. When the general bias of common sense conspires with group bias, it accounts for the tendencies of dominant or privileged groups to exclude from their consideration any fresh and fruitful ideas that come from the so-called less influential or non-privileged groups, and to distort the good ideas of these groups by selfish and expedient compromise. The notion of general bias expresses rather trenchantly this simple fact about human life. The problems which we encounter most regularly require of us, quote, I'm quoting Ken Melton here, a general level of developed capacities and skills in excess of that which is commonly operative, close quote. The human effort, whether of groups or communities or individual persons, to order human life in congruence with the eminent norms of developed intelligence fails quite regularly. The accumulation of oversights and a refusal to overcome the effects of bias to meet those eminent norms of developed intelligence constitute what Lonergan calls the longer cycle of decline. Perhaps from the perspective of decolonial thinkers, we might correlate the longer cycle of decline with the initiation of modernity and colonialism. Now, the continued and cumulative deterioration of a social situation is a consequence of the longer cycle. Rather than the demands of intelligence guiding the situation, bits and pieces of arbitrary, fragmented, biased understanding is behind the wheel. Second, due to the relentless schemes of general bias, normative intelligence is shunned, and so it withdraws. What remains is the product of bias, the social surd, the irrational, or perhaps the colonial matrix of power. The exigencies of intelligence and reason, of self-appropriation, find themselves, quote, irrelevant to the world as it is. Expedient, unscrupulous, willfully and contentedly ignorant, disdainful of all that it cannot immediately dominate or understand. On Lonergan's account, the progress of society and history can never be realized merely through the concrete transformation of the conditions of social or economic or political life. What is required is the development of the intellectual, psychic, and moral capacities of women and men to meet and contest decline, to live by the transcendental precepts: be attentive, be intelligent, be reasonable, be responsible, be in love. Religion, then, has an explicitly social function of promoting self-transcendence to the point of going beyond justice to self-sacrificing love. Religion assumes, quote, a redemptive role in human society, inasmuch as love can undo the mischief of decline and restore the cumulative process of progress, close quote. This is Lonergan. Now, let me say just a little about theology and decoloniality, and I have sort of formulated a quick conclusion, which I didn't have last week, but I have now. So, theology and decoloniality. Given decoloniality's ambivalence, even hostility toward Christianity, does Christian theology have a role? And if so, what is that role? Joseph Drexler Dries poses two possibilities. On the one hand, theologians might merely add border thinking as another dimension to theological reflection. On the other hand, theologians might do theology from the site perspective of colonial difference. Now, in the former approach, marginalized voices may well function as an additive to soothe an increasingly restive, culturally diverse world. In the latter, the historical task of decolonization is given priority. Here I'm going to quote Dries. Theological reflection functions as an option for contributing to this project. And in this latter project, quote, decoloniality and theology are methods of struggle against coloniality and commitments to building alternative futures, close quote. Is it possible to do theology? Lonergan, I think, challenges theologians drawn to decolonial thought to an other way. So recall the opening lines of Method and Theology. A theology mediates between a cultural matrix and the significance and role of a religion in that matrix. Exegeting Lonergan on mediation, Doran writes, the mediation of religion and culture that theology performs is not a simple self-mediation of Christian constitutive meaning, from the data on revelation through their ongoing consequences in history to the contemporary faith of the church, close quote. Theology has another opportunity, and here's what Doran says, an opportunity to mediate a mutually illuminating dialogue, not only between the contemporary faith of the church and the contemporary cultural matrices within which the faith community lives and operates, And in its function of memory, theology is a function of memory, that is research, interpretation, history, and dialectic. In its function of memory, theology dialogues not only with the contemporary faith of the church and the cultural elements that were appropriated by the church, but also between the contemporary faith of the church and elements in previous cultural matrices that may have been overlooked, bypassed, or neglected by the church or by theology. So today, theology helps the church to apologize for past mistakes, both doctrinal and pastoral. So too, at least in the future, if not now, theology will be invited to help the church apologize for mistakes it is making today. It's really a lot to think about. And I came to this mediation notion really late in this process, but it's really worth thinking about. But I'm going to conclude. I want to refer back to the epigraphs with which I began. The first, taken from Marx, is familiar. The philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. The second, taken from Lonergan, very familiar. How indeed is a mind to become conscious of its own bias when that bias springs from a communal flight from understanding and is supported by the whole texture of a civilization? The third is from Maria Lugones. The ontological or metaphysical possibility of liberation remains to be argued, explained, uncovered. If oppression theory is not liberatory, it is useless from the point of view of the oppressed person. It is discouraging, demoralizing. Philosophers all, each sets the progress and decline of human good in society and history in the most basic context, that of the human mind. Further, each challenges us to understand and interpret critically the meanings that structure the world within which we live, to uncover, argue, and explain the possibility of and for liberation. But Lonergan goes even further. In the concrete cumulative complex that is the longer cycle of decline, sin is the social surd, the irrational. To meet the effects of that sin, the absolutely supernatural solution is the self-sacrificing love of God and love of neighbor that radiates out from the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Such love absorbs the surd of sin and breaks the cycle of decline that obstructs the concrete realization of human good in society and history. Only grace, only acceptance of grace makes this possible. And that decision is up to us. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Shawn. That was terrific. Great way to begin. We've got another half hour of respondents and then question and answer coming. And I thought, since we're talking about embodied intelligence here, it might be a good idea if everyone stood up. Raise your hand. Stretch. Turn around.
Don't come over words.
And look at the person next to you and give them a big smile. We're still in the late stages of the COVID thing, so no hugs, no high fives, no handshakes. But get the blood flowing a little bit. Okay, and now return to your seats. So as I said, our forum is meant to engage and explore and expand the thinking of Lonergan in a way that I think is exemplary in the talk that Shawn Copeland just gave, but also to engage those thoughts from a number of different perspectives. And so we have two respondents, and I'm going to introduce both of them together, and then ask our first respondent, Ligita Ryliskyte, to give her response, followed by Andrew Prevot. Dr. Ligita Ryliskyte is a visiting assistant professor of theology here at Boston College. She's published essays on the women of the gulags and Nelson's paradigm of evil becoming a sign of hope against all hope, and on the post-gulag Christology from a Lithuanian perspective. She's written on the signs of hope and redemption that can be discerned in the recent pandemic, and also on the new creation in Christ as the foundation of integral ecology. Professor Ryliskyte did her doctoral studies here at Boston College before joining the faculty. But before she began her studies in theology, she was and continues to practice medicine as a cardiologist in her homeland of Lithuania. So she is, as Professor Copeland said, Professor, Dr. Ryliskyte. And she's also a member of the Lithuanian Congregation of the Sisters of the Eucharistic Jesus. Our second respondent, Professor Andrew Prevot, is Associate Professor of Theology, also here at Boston College, and he's taught here since 2013. He received his doctorate and master's degrees in theology from the University of Notre Dame. His interests and expertises are wide and impressive, beginning with scholarship and teaching in the areas of prayer, spirituality, and Ignatian spirituality in particular, as well as mystical theology. But he's expanded his thought outward into political, liberation, womanist, and black theology. His book publications include Thinking Prayer, Theology and Spirituality Amid the Crisis of Modernity, Theology and Race, Black and Womanist Traditions in the United States, Anti-Blackness and Christian Ethics. And he's currently working on another book entitled The Mysticism of Ordinary Life, Theology, Philosophy, and Feminism. In addition, he is exploring the contributions to mysticism of African and African Americans. He's published over 25 scholarly articles, including most recently Divine Opacity, Mystical Theology, Black Theology, and the Problem of the Light-Dark Aesthetics. Ignatian Spirituality, Political Effectiveness, and Spiritual Discernment, Dean Brackley's account of liberation theology, and Sources of a Black Self, Ethics of Authenticity in an Era of Anti-Blackness. So it's my pleasure to introduce our two respondents. First, Dr. Ryliskyte, and then Dr. Prevot.
Thank you, Dr. Byrne. I'm greatly honored by this opportunity to respond to Dr. Copeland's paper, because it was from Dr. Copeland that I first learned about Lonergan and came to appreciate the broader theological political implications of his work. In a way, this response is a tribute to her as my teacher of Lonergan. A good tribute to one's teachers also involves teasing out some implications of their insights. And to this task, I now turn. To paraphrase Lonergan, Dr. Copeland's paper is both rich in denotation and comprehensive in connotation. It is rich in denotation because her treatment of decolonial thought shows that the progeny of Western European colonialism is well alive and further multiplies in the form of the coloniality of power. The paper is comprehensive in connotation because it intimates how the very possibility of decolonial thought might be grounded in the free unfolding of the conscious dynamism of the human mind. Such a mind follows the precepts: be attentive, be intelligent, be reasonable, be responsible, be in love, and as Lonergan would occasionally add, acknowledge your historicity. By means of exposing side by side the two frameworks, one perhaps categorical and the other transcendental, Dr. Copeland is inviting each of us into a creative exercise. The main question that her paper raises for us, at least for me, as well as begins to disentangle, is how does Lonergan both resonates with decolonial thinkers and perhaps challenge an uncritical appropriation of their thought in theological undertaking? Building on the second part of Dr. Copeland's paper, but without slavishly reproducing her 4 points, in what follows, I foreground 3 major areas of resonance that seem to bear most on doing theology from the side perspective of colonial difference. Critically constructive examination of each of these areas might help our understanding of pluralism in theology, of foundations of theology, and also of the solidaristic aspect of the Christian praxis. First, in agreement with decolonial thought, Lonergan's method in theology employs an empirical notion of culture. In distinction from a classicist notion, the empirical notion of culture admits that none of the cultures is normative in a hegemonic sense. For a classicist, to quote Lonergan, there was but one culture that was both universal and permanent. To its norms and ideals might aspire the uncultured, whether they were the young or the people or the natives or the barbarians, end quote. From the perspective of decolonial thought, this classicist notion of culture reinforces the coloniality of power. In contrast, Lonergan promotes an empirical notion of culture as what the set of meanings and values that informs a way of life, close quote. Correspondingly, his thought seems to support Walter Mignolo's epistemic disobedience and to affirm the emergence of border thinking. To be sure, Lonergan does not elaborate on how exactly the coloniality of power functions to create difference and the false impression of backwardness or inferiority. However, his contribution illuminates how the coloniality of power inclines us to bias, and how bias in turn is in service of producing, evaluating, and managing the colonial difference, thus perpetuating colonialism in its quote-unquote post-colonialist form, that is, a social discrimination in all its incarnations. Conceived as the set of communal meanings and values constitutive of human living, each culture, according to Lonergan, is a moving target. This is so because meaning what is not fixed, static, immutable, but shifting, developing, going astray, capable of redemption, unquote. To use Robert Doran's idiom, the fact that meaning can go astray calls for the dialectics of contradictories. In other words, the fact that meanings get distorted and values get skewed raises a question of normativity, a vexed question from a perspective of modern post-structuralism. Lonergan's great achievement, as Dr. Copeland shows, is that he does not answer that question of normativity in a foundationalist, that is, arbitrary way. Following transcendental precepts is transcultural, not in the sense of canceling out the difference, but in the sense of grounding the possibility of difference and dialogue in the invariant structures of human knowing. This implies that the deconstruction of the coloniality of power does not need to be accompanied by postmodern fragmentation. Correspondingly, pluralism in theology does not have to be relativism. In fact, having plural perspectives in theology assists us in advancing towards the plenitude of divine truth, Dei Verbum 8. However, merely affirming and celebrating differences is insufficient. As Lonergan explains in his essay on doctrinal pluralism, pluralism can be said in many ways. There is pluralism that represents cultural diversity, pluralism rendered by the differentiations of consciousness, and pluralism that results from the presence and absence of intellectual, of moral, or of religious conversion, unquote. To wrap up my first point, decolonial theory can be a valuable dialogue partner for theology, especially as it undertakes the functional tasks that crown its listening phase, that is, history and dialectic. Namely, decolonial thinkers can assist a theologian in her effort to trace and evaluate the historical transmutations of meaning and to demythologize theological consciousness by reducing real and apparent differences to their roots. And yet, what precisely has to be taken forward and developed, and what needs to be reversed in the speaking phase, that is, in theology as doctrinal, systematic, and pastoral, has to be weighed against the foundational reality of conversion. And this conversion is not just intellectual and moral, but also religious, an unconditional falling in love with God, as revealed in Christ Jesus. Second, though decolonial thinkers might critique any discourse on history as inherently flawed, as the discourse through which the West has asserted its hegemony, it still seems that they share with Lonergan a rejection of the liberal notion of progress. Thus, at least performatively, they also recognize the epistemic value afforded by the examination of the dialectic of history as a concrete unfolding of linked but opposed principles of change. The dialectic of history, according to Lonergan, is tripolar, a dynamic compound of progress, decline, and redemptive recovery. The principle of progress is human authenticity, the free unfolding of human intelligence, reasonableness, and responsibility. The truncation of such an unfolding and the principle of decline is bias in its fourfold form, comprehensively illuminated by Dr. Copeland's lecture. Though Lonergan conceives the culprit of decline in terms of human flight from understanding, the fitting remedy and the principle of redemptive recovery is not simply the restoration of intelligence or more of understanding. It is intelligence as transformed by self-donative love, grounded in a kind of universal friendship. Lonergan explains why this should be the case by drawing on the irrationality and longevity of the social cert. Inasmuch as social structures that are supported by bias, such as the structures of racism, patriarchy, or totalitarianism, they are marked by the social cert, the unintelligible, irrational, irresponsible. Furthermore, to escape the discomforts of a cognitional dissonance, we justify such structures by creating pseudo-doctrines originating in common nonsense, such as ideologies of white supremacy, sexism, nationalism, or conspiracy theories. Ideologies, in their turn, distort the scales of values as the social cert is rationalized and the irrational is enthroned as supremely rational. Thus, the recovery from decline is not simply a matter of intelligence, but also of persevering in love, which does a difficult good. To cite Lonergan, aberrations are easy to maintain and difficult to correct. Egoists do not turn into altruists overnight. Hostile groups do not easily forget their grievances, drop their resentments, overcome their fears and suspicions. Common sense commonly feels itself omnicompetent in practical affairs, commonly is blind to long-term consequences of policies and courses of action, commonly is unaware of the admixture of common nonsense in its more cherished convictions and slogans, unquote. In light of the foregoing, Lonergan's dialectic of history can be said to be open upwards in a twofold sense. In the sense of a system open to genuine novelty, that is the fruit of inquiry, and in the sense of a transformative sublation, that is expansion, integration, and enrichment of inquiry by perseverance and living. The twofold openness of Lonergan's tripolar dialectic distinguishes his account from both the Hegelian and Marxist dialectics, insofar as Hegel's triadic dialectic of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis represents a kind of movement enclosed within a complete system, and Marxist dialectical materialism, as Lonergan notes, lumps together the principles of progress and decline. Decolonial thinkers seem to go beyond Hegel and Marx as well, at least by lamenting the Hegelian conflation of history and civilization, and by shifting away from the predominantly economic paradigms of Marxist thought to foreground the unwholesome alliance between power and knowledge. The material effects and implications of colonialism then are understood in terms of an epistemological malaise. What is a suitable remedy for this malaise from the perspective of decolonial thinkers, as Dr. Copeland pointed out, remains quite unclear. Third, not unlike the decolonial theory, which mostly through its post-structuralist parentage critiques the malaises of Western rationality, Lonergan's understanding of the dialectics of history also resists the post-Enlightenment forms of rationalism, in particular the rationalization of power as libido dominante. Though his project is not focused on deconstructing the coloniality of power, Lonergan insists that recovery from decline is achieved not by some type of colonialist or totalitarian power, but in and through the higher integrations of the human good of order, as grounded in critically responsible self-transcendence. Insofar as such self-transcendence can hardly be sustained by relying on the exclusively immanent sources of meaning and value, Lonergan is willing to admit that reflecting on the dialectic of history delivers one at the doorstep of theology. In his essay Questionnaire on Philosophy, Lonergan writes, "The liquidation of individuals, classes, nations does not go to the root of the matter, for the problem of warring egoisms keeps recurring as long as inattentiveness, obtuseness, unreasonableness, irresponsibility keep producing and augmenting the objective sort of the unintelligible and irrational situation. What alone goes to the root of the problem is the new person, the person converted at once intellectually, morally, religiously. The new person will have to love God above all and his fellows as himself, for even-handed justice becomes merely destructive once injustice has penetrated the very fabric of a society." Lonergan develops this juxtaposition of power as merely coercive and power as empowering in his early works on human solidarity in history and in his soteriology. Insofar as decolonial thinkers side with postmodern incredulity toward grand narratives, and by extension with postmodernist anti-humanism, they perhaps are not likely to approve of Lonergan's solution or his method. However, as Leela Gandhi has suggested, insisting that, quote, any universal or normative postulation of rational unanimity is totalitarian and hostile to the challenges of otherness and difference, leaves one facing the apparent chasm. One is left to ponder the chasm between the impossibility of the transcultural and the impossibility of a politics that lacks the principle of solidarity. As Dr. Copeland's own writings that develop Lonergan's insights into human solidarity abundantly demonstrate, this is precisely where theology has something valuable to say in response. To conclude, theories and methodologies adjacent to theology, such as the decolonial theory, can aid theology's search for explanatory meanings of religious symbols and categories by helping to liberate them from ideological usage conducive to the coloniality of power. At the same time, as a reflection on the irreducible mystery of love revealed in Christ Jesus, theology challenges the notion of alterity that forestalls a possibility of cross-cultural consensus by a priori rejection of the transcultural. I hope that Dr. Copeland will offer some further reflection on the non-ideological, non-reductionist, and non-alienating use of decolonial thought by perhaps sharing how decolonial thinkers influence your own way of doing theology. Thank you.
First, I'd like to begin with some words of gratitude. I'd like to thank all of the organizers of this event, including Ligita Ryliskyte, Pat Byrne, Mary Elliott, Jeremy Wilkins, Carrie Cronin, and Ann McInerney, and everyone else who has contributed to making this evening possible. I also want to thank Dr. Shawn Copeland, my mentor, for her brilliant and thought-provoking engagements with Bernard Lonergan throughout her career, including the reflections on sympathetic resonances between his ideas and decolonial theory that she offered us just moments ago. I have learned a great deal from Copeland's development of Lonergan's critical account of bias and her use of it to challenge the intersecting white supremacist and androcentric biases that shape contemporary society, culture, religion, and theology. The synopsis of decolonial theory she has just given us is frankly stunning. I have never seen or heard this complex field of interrogations, categories, and projects expressed so clearly and powerfully. I also want to take a moment to thank my co-panelist, Ligita Ryliskyte, for her own groundbreaking work on Lonergan's soteriology and her wonderful insights today about Lonergan and decolonial theory. My second task, after expressing these words of thanks, is to make some confessions. It won't be as good as Augustine, so don't Okay, so some confessions. First, I must admit that I am not an expert in Lonergan's thought. The only work of his I have read in full and studied closely is his method in theology. And that was roughly 12 or 13 years ago, although I did revisit it in preparation for today. My second confession is that I was initially, and still remain somewhat skeptical about the prospects for an easy compatibility between Lonergan's project and decolonial theory. So I will offer perhaps the most skeptical take thus far today. And yet I would like to see what fruits might come from a sustained conversation about the relationship between these two fields. Copeland's paper lays the groundwork for such a conversation, as well as Ligita's paper. My contribution is simply to share some thoughts in response to 3 questions that I hope will be productive for this conversation. Question 1. Can students of Lonergan draw on some of his ideas to ground and motivate their participation in the struggle against the legacies of conquest and colonialism? My answer to this first question is yes. Number 2, does a decolonial perspective reveal problematic aspects of Lonergan's thought, which implicate it to some degree in colonial constructs of power and knowledge? My answer to this question is also yes. Finally, number 3, does decolonial theory have anything to gain from studying Lonergan? Any insights that would be helpful to its own ends? My answer to this final question is also yes. In short, it's complicated. Although Lonergan is not a decolonial theorist and can be questioned from this angle, some of his central ideas should help his followers recognize the value of decolonial theory and choose to support it. Moreover, there are insights about the human good and the transcendental conditions for its possibility that decolonial theory could learn from Lonergan and from the Western traditions of philosophy and theology on which he draws, even though these sources are by no means problem-free from a decolonial perspective. So first, let me say something about why I think good disciples of Lonergan can and must arrive at a positive commitment to decolonization precisely on the basis of his work. Following, quote, the transcendental precepts, be attentive, be intelligent, be reasonable, and be responsible, would go a long way toward dismantling what Anibal Quijano calls the coloniality of power. This persistent system of violent, hierarchical relations is propped up by a culturally pervasive inattention to the suffering of oppressed groups, a refusal to understand the historical and structural processes that put these groups in this situation, and an unwillingness to form judgments and take decisive actions that would overcome such obvious injustices. Lonergan encourages a process of critical self-discovery and intellectual, moral, and religious conversion toward the true, the good, and ultimately the love of God. The coloniality of power, by contrast, leaves its supporters in an unreflective state of mendacity, cruelty, and idolatry. Lonergan is a perceptive observer of the bad mental habits that lead to the decline of cultures and societies. He locates the root problem in an individual and group egoism, which can take hold of large segments of the population and disconnect them from reality and the pursuit of higher values. When this happens, he says, quote, preference scales become distorted, feelings soured, bias creeps into one's outlook, rationalization into one's morals, ideology into one's thought. So one may come to hate the truly good and love the really evil. It can happen to groups, to nations, to blocks of nations, to mankind, end quote. Lonergan is suspicious of appeals to common sense because these can easily mask corrupted beliefs and values that he calls common nonsense. From a Lonerganian perspective, decolonial theory can be embraced as a reasonable effort to correct the collective biases of a civilization in decline. It can be affirmed as a discourse that seeks to tell the truth and to motivate people to do what is actually good. In the last few days, in preparation for this talk, I've been thinking about how Lonergan would react to the banning of books, the assault on so-called critical race theory, the suppression of black and brown voters, the dehumanization of immigrants, the rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans, the desecration of indigenous lands, the ballooning gap between the ultra-rich and the working poor, the discrimination against women and gender non-conforming persons, and the incessant lying that characterizes contemporary political discourse. He might say, as he did 50 years ago, that, quote, a civilization in decline digs its own grave with relentless consistency. It cannot be argued out of its self-destructive ways, for argument has a theoretical major premise. Theoretical premises are asked to conform to matters of fact, and the facts in the situation produced by decline more and more are the absurdities that proceed from inattention, oversight, unreasonableness, and irresponsibility, end quote. Insofar as decolonial theory is a morally motivated search for greater knowledge, students of Lonergan can and must support it. Why then might Lonergan be vulnerable to critiques coming from decolonial theory? One problem is his Eurocentrism. Although he makes claims that are supposed to be transcendental, he acknowledges, referring to himself in the third person plural, quote, "In the main we have in mind the Western tradition," end quote. Drawing on this tradition is not verboten for decolonial theory, but presupposing that it has an adequate grasp of what is universal in human knowledge and the structure of reality suggests that there is no need to learn anything philosophical from the non-Western other. The assumption that what goes for the West transcendentally goes for the rest suggests a posture of epistemic overconfidence that decolonial theory resists through its affirmation of non-Western knowledges. Whether a transcendental method necessarily violates the norms of decolonial theory is an interesting and disputed question. Following Enrique Dussel, I would suggest that a transcendental method that thinks interculturally and from the point of view of the other is in fact conceivable. Roberto Goizueta's first book puts Dussel and Lonergan into conversation on this very issue. So I'm in agreement with Roberto. And many other things, by the way. So I agree with Dr. Copeland that a decolonial perspective ought to appreciate Lonergan's move from a classicist theory of culture to a more pluralist empirical approach. And Professor Ryliskyte made the same argument. Yet there is, unfortunately in my view, some classicist residue in Lonergan's discussion of so-called primitive peoples. In the first paragraph of Method in Theology, he explains, quote, "The classicist notion of culture was normative, at least de jure there was but one culture that was both universal and permanent. To its norms and ideals might aspire the uncultured, whether they were the young, or the people, or the natives, or the barbarians. Besides the classicist, there is the empirical notion of culture. It is the set of meanings and values that informs a way of life," end quote. Although he seems clearly to favor the latter approach, elsewhere in the text he draws on dubious works of colonialist anthropology, such as Claude Lévi-Strauss's The Savage Mind, Lucien Levy-Bruhl's Mental Functions in Inferior Societies, and E. Evans Pritchard's Theories of Primitive Religion, to argue that the so-called primitive mind does not make the sorts of distinctions achieved by Greek philosophy, which supposedly demonstrate its higher level of cognitive and moral advancement. Although he concedes that one should not assume, quote, any lack of intelligence or reasonableness on the part of primitives, this important concession does not change the classicist thrust of the argument and would not satisfy most decolonial theorists. Also questionable from a decolonial perspective is Lonergan's account of ressentiment. Drawing on Friedrich Nietzsche and Max Scheler, he describes this phenomenon as, quote, a feeling of hostility, anger, and indignation that is neither repudiated nor directly expressed. He says that this feeling occurs in reaction to someone else who is, quote, one superior, physically or intellectually or morally or spiritually. And he describes it as, quote, perhaps the most notable aberration in the development of feelings. On the one hand, I agree with Lonergan that feelings give us information about values that we hold and are therefore intentional responses to our world. I agree with him, too, that one should not suppress feelings, but rather seek greater levels of awareness about them and the values they reveal. On the other hand, however, I worry that his theory of ressentiment stigmatizes the anger experienced by those who have been treated as inferior or made to feel as such because of their position on the undersides of colonial modernity. Lonergan does not acknowledge the fact that Nietzsche uses this and other similar ideas to belittle those who do not share his aristocratic masculinist, and colonialist values. The critique of ressentiment can easily become a way to blame the victim for having reasonable emotional responses to the injustice of their situation. It can inadvertently tell the dehumanized that their feelings are invalid and indeed confirm their supposed moral inferiority. These are just some of the reasons why I think that although supporters of Lonergan can and should embrace decolonial theory precisely on Lonerganian grounds, they also ought to acknowledge certain not necessarily devastating ways that his thought is deeply challenged by it. Like all good conversations, however, this must be a two-way street. There are, in fact, things that decolonial theory might learn from a deeper look at Lonergan. I will bring my remarks to a close by suggesting just two such lessons. First, I believe that Lonergan can be helpful in the ongoing and legitimate search for a greater understanding of our shared humanity. Sylvia Wynter critiques the overrepresentation of man, but she does so in the name of a wider and more adequate conception of humanity, not some proposed alternative to it. What makes all of us human, regardless of how we have been positioned in relation to the colonial divide, remains an open question. In my view, Lonergan's account of the dynamic structure of human consciousness is not a bad sketch or hypothesis. Although I might quibble with this or that point, I find much of his account persuasive. It sheds light on my own human experience as a conscious agent in the world. I think it is a mistake to give up on the quest for the universal and settle for reified versions of antagonistic particularity. This is a temptation in some decolonial theory, insofar as it divides the world sharply into colonizer and colonized, as if these conditions, and not our shared humanity, were the real essence of each individual. Although Lonergan's confidence in the success of his transcendental method may be a bit inflated, his desire for such an inclusive view of what it means to be human is to me quite appealing and admirable. Second, as a Christian theologian, I share Lonergan's belief that the love of God is and ought to be our highest value. Although Walter Mignolo and other decolonial theorists are right to tell the truth about the history of colonial violence against religious and racial others perpetrated by Christian individuals and institutions, I do not believe that these horrors and contradictions constitute the true essence or meaning of Christianity. That essence is the love of God in both the objective and subjective senses of the genitive. Lonergan helps us to distinguish the various tasks that a creative and collaborative community of theologians might pursue in order to seek a better understanding of this love. This is the main contribution of his method in theology, and one of the reasons why we should continue reading this book. He is clear as well that any religion that actually embodies this love would have a socially transformative impact. He writes, and Dr. Copeland has already quoted part of this passage, quote, "A religion that promotes transcendence to the point not merely of justice, but of self-sacrificing love, will have a redemptive role in human society, inasmuch as such love can undo the mischief of decline and restore the cumulative process of progress," end quote. The question with which Lonergan leaves us is thus whether Christians can learn how to be authentically Christian, whether they can grow and change in the right ways while adhering to the eternal, whether they can live truly for the other. Thank you.
Ligita and Andrew, for your responses, and I found them really very stimulating and exciting, and we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about that. The one thing I would just say on this end is Baldwin, because Baldwin has a way of doing a kind of literary analysis that reminds us who resents who in this configuration that is the United States. I mean, there's a certain kind of way in which projection on the racialized other is a way to deal with some of this issue of resentment, because we always, it's good, we put resentment only on one side of the equation, and it's trying to get at the fact that it works on both sides, not just one, yeah. I appreciate that very much, yeah, I really appreciate that.